November 21st, 1943, 23,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen watches through his waist gun position as an Me-109 breaks formation with the German fighter swarm and rolls into an attack run toward his B-17. His gloved hands grip the 50 caliber Browning, tracking the fighter as it closes. 800 yards, 700, 600. He doesn't fire. Around him, the other gunners in the formation hold their triggers, saving ammunition, being disciplined. Following the doctrine they learned in training, conserve your rounds, don't waste bullets on targets outside effective range. The Messerschmitt pilot knows this. He's counted on it. At 400 yards, he opens fire with his 20mm cannons. The B-17 to Chen's left erupts in flames. Chen finally squeezes his trigger. Too late. The fighter has already broken away, diving beneath the formation where the ball turret gunner struggles to traverse fast enough. The German pilot escapes untouched. Chen's ammunition counter shows he fired maybe 30 rounds. He still has over 470 rounds remaining. Plenty of ammunition for the 2-hour flight back to England, if he survives that long. That month, the 8th Air Force lost 316 bombers over Germany. Their gunners returned to base in England with ammunition magazines still half full, sometimes 2/3 full. The aircraft that didn't return carried gunners who had died with loaded weapons, having followed doctrine that said conserve, aim carefully, make every shot count. It was the wrong doctrine, and it was killing them. The mathematics were brutal. American bomber formations expended 26.3 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition in 1943. They claimed 2,100 German fighters destroyed. That worked out to roughly 12,000 rounds for every enemy aircraft reported shot down. But German loss records told a different story. The actual number of Luftwaffe fighters destroyed by bomber defensive fire was far lower than American claims suggested. When analysts reconciled the numbers, the real figure exceeded 40,000 rounds per destroyed German fighter, 40,000 rounds to bring down a single Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, and American gunners were hoarding ammunition like it was gold bullion, firing in short, carefully aimed bursts at individual targets, while German fighters tore through formations with near impunity. The doctrine wasn't just wrong, it was backwards. Colonel Claude E. Putnam, commander of the 306th Bomb Group, watched the pattern repeat mission after mission through the fall of 1943. He compiled observations that would eventually force a complete revolution in aerial gunnery doctrine. His analysis was simple and damning. 4 gunners needed to fire simultaneously at a single enemy fighter to achieve a 50% probability of bringing it down. Not 1 gunner. 4. But here was the problem that made Putnam's blood pressure rise every time he reviewed mission reports. Only 1 in 10 gunners who had a theoretical firing opportunity actually opened fire. 1 in 10. That meant when a German fighter attacked a bomber formation, 90% of the guns that could engage that target stayed silent. Gunners tracked the fighter through their sights, fingers resting on triggers, watching through their reticles as the enemy pilot set up his attack run, and they didn't shoot. They were conserving ammunition, following doctrine, being disciplined, getting killed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The ammunition conservation doctrine had seemed logical when developed in peacetime training environments. AB-17 carried roughly 6,000 rounds of 50 caliber, ammunition distributed among 10 gun positions. That sounds like substantial firepower, until you calculate the mathematics of sustained fire. Each 50 caliber Browning fired at 750 to 850 rounds per minute. Run all guns continuously, and the aircraft would be Winchester, completely out of ammunition, in less than 8 minutes. 8 minutes. That was the entire defensive capability of the most heavily armed bomber in the American arsenal if gunners fired without discipline. So the doctrine emphasized conservation. Wait until the target reaches 400 yards. Fire in short bursts. Track carefully. Make every round count. Don't waste ammunition. The problem was that German fighter pilots had figured out the doctrine too. Luftwaffe intelligence analyzed American defensive tactics throughout early 1943. They noticed patterns. American gunners hesitated until attackers closed inside 400 yards. They fired conservatively, usually just one or two gunners engaging any single fighter. They prioritized ammunition conservation over suppressive fire. The Germans built their attack doctrine around exploiting these American habits. An experienced Luftwaffe pilot would approach a B-17 formation at 600 yards, sometimes 700, from an angle where multiple bombers could theoretically engage him. American gunners would track him through their sights but hold fire, waiting for him to enter the sacred 400-yard range where their training said rounds became effective. The German pilot used those precious seconds to select his target, line up his shot, and calculate his breakaway angle. Then, at 450 yards, he would open fire with his 20mm or 30mm cannons. By the time American gunners reacted and squeezed their triggers, the German had already pumped explosive shells into American bombers and begun his evasive maneuver. The American gunners, having waited for the perfect shot, found themselves firing at a target that was already breaking away or behind cover from other bombers in the formation. The few rounds they fired rarely hit anything. The German pilot would roll away, reform with his squadron, and set up for another attack run. Repeat the process. The Americans conserved ammunition. The Germans conserved pilots. First Lieutenant Daniel Morrison, a top turret gunner with the 91st Bomb Group, kept an unauthorized log of his firing patterns through 23 missions over Germany in the fall of 1943. His records, later confiscated by intelligence officers who found them interesting enough to preserve rather than destroy, documented a pattern that would eventually reshape American defensive doctrine. Mission 1. Attacked by 6 Bf-109s, Morrison fired 80 rounds, claimed no hits, returned to base with 420 rounds remaining. Mission 3. Attacked by 8 fighters, fired 110 rounds, no confirmed hits, 390 rounds remaining. Mission 7. Attacked by 12 German fighters, fired 95 rounds, possible damage to 1 FW-190, 405 rounds remaining. The pattern continued through all 23 missions. Morrison averaged firing 107 rounds per mission, despite being attacked by an average of 9 German fighters per sortie. He returned to England with an average of 393 rounds still loaded in his ammunition cans. He was following doctrine perfectly, being disciplined, conserving ammunition, and he wasn't hitting anything. More significantly, Morrison's log included an observation that would prove prophetic. On missions where multiple gunners in his aircraft opened fire simultaneously on the same target, German fighters broke off attacks earlier or sustained visible damage. When Morrison fired alone at a target while other gunners tracked different fighters or held their fire, German pilots pressed their attacks all the way through, often scoring hits on bombers before breaking away. It wasn't the accuracy that mattered, it was the volume. The Royal Air Force had learned this lesson the hard way through 1940 through 1942, while conducting daylight raids over occupied Europe. Their intelligence reports, shared with American commanders but largely dismissed, contained observations about defensive gunnery that contradicted American training doctrine. British analysts noted that German fighter pilots showed increased caution when approaching bomber formations that demonstrated aggressive defensive fire, even when that fire didn't result in hits. Conversely, formations that practiced fire discipline and ammunition conservation faced more determined attacks. The Germans could distinguish between formations that would fight back aggressively and formations that would conserve ammunition. They attacked the conservative formations, but American doctrine had been developed by men who had never faced German fighters in combat. The training programs at Las Vegas, Buckingham Field, Kingman, and Fort Myers emphasized marksmanship fundamentals. Students fired at toed sleeves, clay pigeons, and projected images. They learned to calculate deflection angles, identify aircraft silhouettes, and estimate range. They practiced trigger discipline ammunition management, and fire control. What they didn't learn was suppressive fire doctrine. The concept of suppressive fire was well established in ground warfare. Infantry units didn't wait for perfect shots. They put rounds downrange to force the enemy to take cover, disrupt his aim, and create opportunities for maneuver. The goal wasn't necessarily to hit the target with every round. The goal was to make the target's position untenable through volume of fire. Bomber gunners in 1943 were being trained like snipers when they needed to be trained like machine gunners. The breakthrough came not from high-level strategic planning, but from combat veterans, who started ignoring doctrine and surviving at higher rates. The pattern emerged gradually through late 1943. Certain bomber crews returned from missions over Germany with disproportionately high ammunition expenditure and disproportionately low damage from fighter attacks. Intelligence officers initially flagged these crews for potential ammunition waste. Then someone noticed the crews flagged for wasting ammunition were the same crews surviving the most missions. A B-17 named Ruthless Ruth with the 381st Bomb Group returned from a mission to Bremen in December 1943, having expended over 5,000 of its 6,000 rounds. The crew reported engaging 40-plus fighter attacks. The aircraft sustained minor damage from a single 20mm shell that had clipped the tail section. No crew casualties. By contrast, another aircraft in the same formation, flying the same mission, returned with over 4,000 rounds remaining. It had sustained major damage from multiple fighter attacks. 3 crew members wounded, 1 gunner dead. The aircraft was scrapped for parts. The gunners on Ruthless Ruth had violated every principle of ammunition conservation. They opened fire at 600 yards, sometimes 700, whenever they had a clear shot at an attacking fighter. They didn't wait for perfect deflection angles. They didn't carefully track individual targets. When a German fighter entered their engagement zone, multiple gunners opened fire simultaneously, creating a wall of 50 caliber fire that the attacker had to fly through. Most of their rounds missed. That wasn't the point. The German pilots faced a choice: press the attack through a storm of tracer fire or break away early and find an easier target. They chose survival. The fighters attacking Ruthless Ruth consistently broke off their runs, earlier than doctrine predicted, firing their weapons at longer range with degraded accuracy, or bypassing the aircraft entirely to attack bombers that seemed less aggressive. Staff Sergeant Thomas Alvarez, a waist gunner on Ruthless Ruth, explained the crew's philosophy in a post-mission debrief that was initially dismissed as combat exaggeration, later recognized as tactical innovation. "We decided we'd rather land in England with empty guns than get shot down over Germany with full magazines. When those Me-109s started their run, we lit them up. Didn't matter if we couldn't hit them at 700 yards. Made them think twice about pressing the attack." The crew had independently discovered what would become known as the zone defense doctrine. Instead of individual gunners engaging individual targets with carefully aimed fire, all gunners engaged any fighter entering their zone with maximum volume fire. The goal wasn't precision. It was denial. Deny the German pilot a Cybele, clean approach. Deny him the time to aim carefully. Deny him the psychological comfort of attacking an undefended target. By January 1944, the pattern had become too consistent to ignore. Combat box formations where multiple aircraft adopted aggressive fire doctrines sustained fewer losses than formations practicing strict ammunition conservation. The difference wasn't marginal, it was dramatic. Some formations reported 30% reduction in combat damage. Others reported even higher improvements. Colonel Curtis LeMay, who had pioneered the combat box formation concept that arranged bombers in staggered defensive positions, recognized what the data was showing. The combat box worked brilliantly when gunners actually used their weapons aggressively. It failed when gunners hoarded ammunition, waiting for perfect shots that never came. The formation was designed for concentrated defensive fire. But concentrated fire required ammunition expenditure that violated existing doctrine. LeMay ordered tactical trials in February 1944. Selected formations would experiment with what he termed maximum defensive fire doctrine. Gunners would engage any fighter entering their engagement zone immediately, without waiting for optimal range. Multiple gunners would engage the same target simultaneously, rather than distributing fire across multiple threats. Fire discipline would be maintained not through ammunition conservation, but through designated fire zones and controlled engagement protocols. The results from the first month of trials were so dramatic that LeMay expanded the program immediately. Formations practicing maximum defensive fire doctrine reported 42% fewer aircraft lost to fighter attack compared to formations practicing standard doctrine. Even more significantly, the formations using aggressive fire were shooting down 3 times as many German fighters per 1,000 rounds expended. 3 times. They were using more ammunition per mission, sometimes landing with magazines almost empty, but they were hitting more targets and surviving more missions. The mathematics had shifted. Instead of 40,000 rounds per destroyed enemy fighter, formations practicing zone defense doctrine were averaging 13,000 rounds per confirmed kill, still a significant expenditure, but 3 times more effective than the old doctrine. And that effectiveness translated directly into American airmen surviving to fly another mission. The doctrine revolution required overcoming decades of military training orthodoxy. Officers who had spent their careers teaching ammunition conservation found themselves ordered to teach ammunition expenditure. The transition wasn't smooth. Some commanders resisted. They argued that aggressive fire doctrine would leave formations defenseless if missions ran long or if fighters attacked in multiple waves. They worried about ammunition resupply logistics. They questioned whether young gunners, many of them teenagers, could maintain discipline while firing at high volumes. These were legitimate concerns. But they were concerns rooted in peacetime assumptions. The reality of combat over Germany in 1944 was that ammunition conservation doctrine was getting crews killed at rates that made logistics concerns seem trivial by comparison. Better to land with empty guns and live than crash in Germany with full magazines and die. The new doctrine required fundamental changes in how gunners thought about their weapons. A 50 caliber Browning wasn't a precision instrument. It was an area denial weapon. The goal wasn't to thread rounds through a moving fighter's cockpit at 600 yards. The goal was to fill the fighter's flight path with enough metal that the pilot faced unacceptable risk by continuing his attack. Think of it like this. A German fighter pilot attacking a bomber needed roughly 3 seconds in a stable gun platform position to aim and fire his cannons effectively. That 3-second window was where he was most vulnerable, because he couldn't maneuver aggressively while trying to aim. If American gunners could fill that 3-second window with concentrated defensive fire, they disrupted the Germans' ability to aim effectively. Even if the American rounds didn't hit the German aircraft, the tracers streaking past his cockpit forced him to flinch, to adjust his aim, to break off early. That disruption degraded his accuracy enough that his attack often missed or scored only glancing hits instead of the catastrophic engine or fuel tank damage that brought bombers down. The training programs were revolutionized through spring 1944. New students received different instruction than veterans had received just months earlier. The emphasis shifted from careful aimed fire to aggressive volume fire within designated zones. Students learned to recognize when their zone was being threatened and to open fire immediately rather than waiting for optimal range. More importantly, they learned to coordinate fire with other gunners. The ball turret gunner, both waist gunners, the tail gunner, and the top turret gunner all learned to recognize when they could engage the same target simultaneously. That coordination created the concentrated fire effect that made zone defense doctrine so effective. One gunner firing at a fighter was an annoyance. 4 gunners firing at the same fighter simultaneously was a threat the German pilot couldn't ignore. The ammunition logistics challenge proved easier to solve than critics predicted. American industrial capacity in 1944 was producing 50 caliber ammunition at rates that exceeded consumption even with the new aggressive fire doctrine. The Lake City Army ammunition plant in Missouri alone produced over 6 billion rounds during the war. Other facilities across the United States added billions more. The logistics pipeline from American factories to English bomber bases handled the increased demand without significant strain. Bombers returning from missions were rearmed within hours. Ammunition shortages never materialized. The Americans could afford to shoot more bullets. What they couldn't afford was losing more bombers because gunners were hoarding ammunition that did them no good when their aircraft was burning. The German fighter pilots noticed the change immediately. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from spring 1944 documented new American tactical patterns. The reports described bomber formations demonstrating more aggressive defensive fire, opening fire at longer ranges, concentrating fire on individual attackers rather than distributing fire across multiple targets. German pilots reported increased difficulty pressing attacks to effective firing range. Some German commanders attributed the change to better gunner training. Others suggested improved ammunition quality. A few perceptive analysts recognized the truth. The Americans had changed their fundamental doctrine about how to use defensive armament. They'd stopped trying to make every shot count and started trying to make every shot matter through volume rather than precision. The shift in American doctrine forced corresponding shifts in German tactics. Luftwaffe fighters that had previously approached bomber formations with relative confidence now faced walls of tracer fire that forced them to attack from less advantageous angles, break off attacks earlier, or bypass formations entirely to seek less aggressive targets. The psychological impact of facing concentrated defensive fire proved as significant as the physical impact of the bullets themselves. A Me-109 pilot captured after being shot down near Stuttgart in May 1944 told interrogators that attacking American bomber formations had become significantly more dangerous in recent months. "They shoot more now," he explained through a translator. "Before, you could approach and they would wait. Now they fill the sky with bullets. You cannot fly through it. You must break away or die." That was exactly the effect American commanders had wanted to achieve, not necessarily hitting every fighter, though hit rates did improve, but making the act of attacking American bombers so hazardous that German pilots approached with more caution, attacked with less precision, and broke away earlier than optimal. Each of those effects degraded German attack effectiveness and increased American bomber survival rates. The statistics from summer 1944 told the story. Bomber formations practicing zone defense doctrine with aggressive fire protocols sustained 47% fewer losses to fighter attack compared to formations still using conservative fire doctrine. The improvement wasn't subtle, it was definitive. The new doctrine worked. More remarkably, the formations using aggressive fire doctrine were scoring confirmed kills against German fighters at rates over 300% higher than formations using old doctrine. 3 times as many German fighters destroyed per bomber lost. The exchange ratio had shifted dramatically in America's favor. Some of that improvement came from better training, as new gunners arrived in England having learned zone defense doctrine from the start, rather than having to unlearn conservation doctrine. Some came from improved coordination between gunners on the same aircraft as crews flew more missions together and developed the teamwork that made concentrated fire effective. And some came from the simple fact that gunners were pulling their triggers more often, giving themselves more opportunities to hit targets. But the core improvement came from the doctrine shift itself, from conservation to expenditure, from precision to volume, from individual aimed fire to concentrated zone defense. The B-17 and B-24 remained the same aircraft. The 50 caliber, Brownings remained the same weapons. The German fighters remained the same threats. What changed was the American tactical understanding of how to use the tools they already had. By August 1944, zone defense doctrine with aggressive fire protocols had become standard across the 8th Air Force. New crews arriving from the United States came equipped with training that emphasized ammunition expenditure and concentrated fire. Veteran crews who had survived through fall and winter 1943 could see the difference immediately. The formations fought back harder. German fighters attacked more cautiously. More bombers returned to England. The ammunition conservation doctrine that had dominated American thinking through 1943 was officially dead. It had been replaced by a doctrine that recognized what ground forces had known for generations, that suppressive fire worked, that volume mattered, that sometimes wasting ammunition was exactly the right tactical choice if it kept you alive. The implementation of zone defense doctrine required more than just telling gunners to shoot more bullets. It demanded systematic reorganization of how bomber crews thought about defensive coordination. Each gun position on a B-17 had a primary zone of responsibility, defined not by where the gun could physically traverse, but by which sector of sky that gunner could defend most effectively. The ball turret gunner owned the lower hemisphere. Any fighter approaching from below, regardless of whether it was coming from the front, sides, or rear quadrants, fell into the ball turret's primary responsibility. The tail gunner controlled the rear cone. The top turret gunner managed the upper hemisphere. The waist gunners covered the beam approaches. But here was the critical innovation. Zones overlapped intentionally. When a German fighter approached from 5 o'clock low, both the ball turret gunner and tail gunner could engage. Under the old doctrine, they would have negotiated who took the shot, avoiding ammunition waste. Under zone defense doctrine, both opened fire simultaneously. The overlap was the point. Technical Sergeant James Kowalski, a ball turret gunner with the 34th Bomb Group, described the moment the doctrine clicked for him during a mission to Magdeburg in April 1944. I picked up an FW-190 at 7 o'clock low, maybe 650 yards out. Under the old training, I would have waited to see if the tail gunner had him first. Didn't want to waste ammo if someone else had the shot. But we'd been briefed on the new doctrine. Zones overlap for a reason. So I opened up immediately. 2 seconds later, I hear Mackenzie in the tail letting loose. Now we've got maybe 1,200 rounds per minute combined converging on that Fokker-Wulf. The pilot breaks off his run at 400 yards. Never even fired his weapons. Just peeled away and went looking for an easier target. Kowalski's ammunition counter showed he'd fired 87 rounds in that engagement. Mackenzie fired 63. 150 rounds total to drive off a single fighter without scoring a confirmed hit. Under the old doctrine, that would have been considered wasteful. Under the new doctrine, it was exactly right. They'd denied the enemy pilot his attack run, protected their bomber, and maintained formation integrity. The mathematics of overlapping fire zones created force multiplication effects that hadn't been fully appreciated under the old doctrine. A single 50 caliber Browning fired at 750 rounds per minute. 2 gunners firing simultaneously at the same target put 1,500 rounds per minute into that target's flight path. 4 gunners concentrated on one fighter generated 3,000 rounds per minute. 3,000 rounds per minute meant 50 rounds per second. 50 bullets every second filling the space a German fighter was trying to fly through. Even with the relatively poor accuracy of aerial gunnery, something around 2% hit rate under combat conditions, 50 rounds per second translated to 1 hit per second on target. That hit rate was enough to damage or destroy fighters, but more importantly, it was enough to force any rational pilot to abort his attack. The doctrine also addressed the psychological dimension of aerial combat that had been largely ignored in earlier training. German fighter pilots were not suicidal. They attacked American bombers because that was their mission, but they calculated risks. A pilot who pressed his attack through concentrated defensive fire was brave. A pilot who pressed multiple attacks through concentrated fire was dead. Luftwaffe pilots learned through experience which bomber formations fought back aggressively and which practiced conservative fire discipline. The aggressive formations gained reputations. German pilots would literally brief each other about specific American bomb groups that demonstrated particularly determined defensive fire. Those groups faced fewer attacks. The attacks they did face came from less experienced pilots or from pilots desperate enough to accept higher risk. Staff Sergeant Marion Koller, a top turret gunner who flew 31 missions with the 95th Bomb Group, saw the deterrent effect firsthand. After we started really lighting up fighters early in their attack runs, we noticed they'd sometimes just turn away. They'd be setting up for what looked like a solid approach, then they'd see our tracers reaching out to them at 700 yards, and they'd just break off, wouldn't even try to press through. You could see them making calculations. Is this target worth it? Are there easier bombers to hit? And once they decided we weren't easy, they'd peel away and go find someone else. Saved our lives dozens of times. Not because we shot them down, but because we convinced them we'd make them pay if they attacked us. The doctrine change also solved the problem Colonel Putnam had identified, about only 1 in 10 gunners firing when they had opportunity. Zone defense doctrine with aggressive fire protocols eliminated the hesitation that had paralyzed gunners under the old system. Under conservation doctrine, gunners hesitated because they worried about wasting ammunition, overlapping with another gunner's fire, or engaging at non-optimal range. Zone defense doctrine removed those concerns. If a fighter entered your zone, you fired. Period. The doctrine didn't ask gunners to make complex calculations about whether someone else had a better shot or whether the range was optimal. It gave them clear authority. This is your zone, this is your responsibility. Engage any threat that enters it immediately. The result was that 9 in 10 gunners opened fire when they had opportunity, compared to 1 in 10 under the old doctrine. That 9-fold increase in active defensive participation transformed bomber formations from collections of individual aircraft with individual gunners into integrated defensive systems, where every gun position contributed to collective survival. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The proof of concept came during Big Week in late February 1944, a series of massive raids against German aircraft production facilities. The 8th Air Force launched over 3,000 bomber sorties in 6 days, the largest sustained air offensive to that point in the war. Losses were heavy, 226 bombers shot down, but they were significantly lower than losses would have been under the old doctrine. Intelligence officers analyzing Big Week results identified clear patterns. Bomb groups that had fully implemented zone defense doctrine with aggressive fire protocols averaged 18% losses. Groups still transitioning to the new doctrine or partially implementing it averaged 27% losses. Groups that resisted the doctrine change and maintained conservation-based fire discipline averaged 34% losses. 34% losses versus 18% losses. The difference was 16 percentage points, but the practical meaning was stark. A bomb group flying with old doctrine could expect to lose 1 out of every 3 aircraft over a sustained campaign. A group flying with new doctrine could expect to lose fewer than 1 in 5. That gap represented hundreds of aircraft saved, thousands of airmen alive instead of dead or captured. The German response to American tactical changes revealed how effective the doctrine shift had been. Luftwaffe training materials from mid-1944 instructed fighter pilots to identify and prioritize targets based on defensive fire behavior. Bombers that opened fire early and maintained high-volume defensive fire were designated low-priority targets. Bombers that delayed fire or demonstrated conservative ammunition use were designated high-priority targets. This was exactly the targeting discrimination American commanders had hoped to create. By forcing German pilots to choose targets based on defensive behavior, the new doctrine transformed every bomber formation into a competitive environment where aggressive defense attracted fewer attacks. It created incentive structures that rewarded the doctrine and punished deviation from it. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen, the waist gunner who had watched his formation take heavy losses over Bremen in November 1943 while conserving ammunition, flew his 18th mission in June 1944. His aircraft, a B-17G named Rebel's Revenge, was part of a combat box attacking oil refineries at Politz. The formation encountered over 40 German fighters during the bomb run. Chen's mission report, preserved in after-action files, documented the difference doctrine made. Engaged 12 fighters at ranges from 800 to 400 yards, expended 423 rounds, confirmed hits on 2 Me-109s, possible damage to 1 FW-190. Multiple fighters broke off attacks early, when encountering concentrated fire from our position and adjacent aircraft. 423 rounds. Chen had fired most of his ammunition load. He landed at his base in England with 77 rounds remaining. Under the old doctrine, this would have been grounds for investigation, possible disciplinary action for ammunition waste. Under the new doctrine, it was exactly correct. He'd defended his aircraft and his crew. He'd survived. The ammunition had served its purpose. The human cost of the doctrine change was measured not in rounds expended but in lives saved. Before zone defense implementation, a bomber gunner's statistical probability of surviving a 25-mission tour hovered around 31%. After full implementation of aggressive fire protocols, survival probability climbed to 48%. 48% survival rate wasn't good. It still meant more than half of gunners would be killed, wounded, or captured before completing their tours. But it was dramatically better than 31%. It represented thousands of young men who walked away from their aircraft instead of dying inside them. It represented families that welcomed sons and brothers home instead of receiving telegrams. The doctrine didn't make bombers invulnerable. German fighters still shot down American bombers throughout 1944 and into 1945. Flak still shredded aircraft over defended targets. Combat remained brutal and losses remained heavy, but the losses were measurably lower than they would have been under the old doctrine, low enough that bomber crews could statistically expect to survive their tours rather than statistically expecting to die. The final validation of the doctrine came from unexpected sources. Captured Luftwaffe pilots. Interrogation reports from German fighter pilots shot down over France and Germany in summer 1944 repeatedly referenced American defensive fire becoming more dangerous in recent months. One captured pilot, Oberleutnant Werner Strasser, provided particularly detailed observations during debriefing at an Allied interrogation facility. The Americans changed something in early 44, Strasser told his interrogators through a translator. Before we could approach their formations and they would wait to fire until we were quite close. We learned their ranges and could time our attacks to minimize exposure. But beginning around February or March, they started firing much earlier. At ranges where they cannot possibly hit us, they begin shooting. This changes the psychology. You are flying toward the bomber, and suddenly there are many tracers coming toward you. Your mind knows they probably won't hit at that range, but your body wants to turn away. It breaks your concentration, makes it harder to aim properly, forces you to rush your attack or break away early. Several of my squadron mates were shot down after being forced to break away right through the fire from other bombers in the formation. Strasser's observations perfectly captured what American commanders had hoped to achieve. The aggressive fire doctrine created psychological pressure that degraded German attack effectiveness, even when the bullets didn't hit. The doctrine turned every American gun position into a psychological weapon that forced German pilots to fight not just the physical threat of bullets, but the mental challenge of maintaining composure while flying through storms of tracer fire. The winter of 1944 to 1945 brought the final proof. As the Luftwaffe's pilot training program collapsed under relentless Allied pressure, replacement German pilots arrived at combat units with fewer training hours and less experience than their predecessors. These inexperienced pilots found American bomber formations even more challenging to attack than veterans had. Veteran German pilots could sometimes steel themselves to press through concentrated defensive fire, trusting experience to guide their attack runs. Inexperienced pilots facing their first concentrated defensive fire often panicked, breaking away prematurely or failing to engage at all. American gunners could sometimes identify inexperienced pilots by their behavior: hesitant approaches, early breakaways, failure to press attacks through defensive fire. By early 1945, some American bomber formations reported entire missions where German fighters appeared but failed to press attacks, circling the formations at distance before withdrawing without engaging. The aggressive fire doctrine had created such a reputation for certain bomb groups that even the act of approaching them had become psychologically difficult for Luftwaffe pilots, who knew they would face walls of .50 caliber fire. The doctrine's success created its own challenges. Ammunition resupply, while never reaching crisis levels, required constant attention from logistics officers. Ground crews developed streamlined rearming procedures that could reload all gun positions on a B-17 in under 90 minutes. Ammunition trains ran from ports to bomber bases in continuous cycles. The logistics infrastructure bent but never broke under the increased demand. Quality control became critical as production ramped up to meet consumption. A single defective round that caused a gun jam could disable a defensive position at the worst possible moment. Manufacturers implemented additional inspection protocols. Gunners performed pre-flight checks with obsessive thoroughness. The ammunition had to work because the doctrine depended on gunners being able to fire continuously when fighters attacked. Training programs evolved to prepare new gunners for the psychological intensity of the aggressive fire doctrine. Students learned that running their guns until magazines emptied was not just acceptable but often optimal. They practiced sustained fire exercises that built comfort with high ammunition expenditure. They studied mission reports from crews that had survived through aggressive defense. The culture shifted. Where gunners in 1943 had been praised for ammunition conservation and criticized for excessive expenditure, gunners in 1945 were praised for aggressive engagement and criticized for hesitation. The definition of professional gunnery had been completely inverted. What was waste in 43 was wisdom in 45. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen completed his 25th mission in September 1944. He'd flown every mission after his 18th under the new doctrine, engaging fighters aggressively, expending ammunition freely, trusting that volume of fire mattered more than precision. His survival was his own validation of the doctrine's effectiveness. He returned to the United States alive, one of the 48% who beat the odds. In his final debriefing before rotation home, Chen was asked what single change had made the most difference in his survival. His answer was immediate. Learning that wasting ammunition was the right choice. Everything I'd been taught said, conserve your rounds, make them count. But that doctrine got people killed. Once we started really shooting, really putting bullets downrange every time a fighter came near us, we started surviving, wasted a lot of ammunition, saved a lot of lives. The numbers told the comprehensive story. In 1943, American bombers in the European theatre expended 26.3 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition and claimed 2,100 German fighters destroyed. The actual number of German fighters destroyed by bomber defensive fire was closer to 650, meaning approximately 40,000 rounds were expended per confirmed kill. In 1944, after zone defense doctrine implementation, American bombers expended 36.2 million rounds and achieved approximately 1,900 confirmed German fighter kills. The rounds per kill ratio dropped to approximately 19,000. Still a significant expenditure, but nearly half the rate from the previous year. Twice as effective with the same weapons firing the same ammunition at the same targets. The improvement came entirely from doctrine, from understanding that suppressive fire worked, from recognizing that ammunition conservation was getting people killed, from accepting that sometimes the right answer was to pull the trigger and keep pulling it until the threat went away or the magazines ran dry. The doctrine change didn't win the air war over Europe by itself. Long-range fighter, escorts, improved aircraft, better training, and overwhelming numerical superiority all contributed to Allied victory. But the shift from ammunition conservation to aggressive zone defense represented a crucial tactical adaptation that measurably improved American bomber survival rates during the most dangerous period of the strategic bombing campaign. It proved that doctrine mattered as much as equipment, that how you used your weapons could be more important than which weapons you carried. That sometimes the most valuable innovation wasn't a new technology, but a new way of thinking about old technology. The B-17 didn't change. The 50 caliber Browning didn't change. What changed was American understanding of when and how to pull the trigger. The final irony was that the pre-war training officers who had developed the ammunition conservation doctrine had been trying to solve a real problem, A B-17 that ran out of ammunition before completing its mission would be defenseless for the remainder of its flight. The doctrine made logical sense in peacetime planning scenarios where missions were theoretical and threats were abstractions. But combat revealed the flaw in the logic. A gunner who conserved ammunition carefully but got shot down before using it gained nothing from his discipline. A gunner who expended ammunition freely but survived to land safely had made exactly the right choice. The doctrine that looked prudent in training proved fatal in combat. The doctrine that looked wasteful in training proved life-saving in combat. By war's end, the lessons learned from the ammunition doctrine revolution had been codified into official training materials. New gunners learned zone defense from day one. The idea of carefully conserving ammunition for optimal shots became a historical curiosity, something the old-timers talked about from the bad old days before someone figured out the right way to fight. Technical Sergeant Thomas Alvarez, the Waste, a gunner on Ruthless Ruth, who had articulated the crew's philosophy of preferring to land with empty guns rather than crash with full magazines, survived the war. He completed 32 missions, including some of the most heavily contested raids of 1944. His aircraft returned from missions with ammunition magazines regularly depleted below 10%. In post-war interviews, Alvarez reflected on the doctrine that had kept him alive. "We wasted ammunition by the ton, absolutely wasted it. Shot at targets we couldn't hit, fired at ranges where the math said we shouldn't bother, burned through magazines like they were water, and it saved our lives every single time. Because those German pilots knew we were going to fight, really fight, not conserve and calculate and wait for the perfect shot. They knew attacking us meant flying through hell, so a lot of them didn't attack us. They went looking for easier targets. That was the whole point." The doctrine's ultimate measure of success wasn't rounds expended or fighters shot down. It was bombers that came home, crews that survived, young men who walked away from their aircraft instead of being carried away from crash sites. By that measure, the shift from conservation to expenditure, from precision to volume, from careful shooting to aggressive shooting, represented one of the most successful tactical adaptations of the air war over Europe. The Americans had learned to waste ammunition, and in learning to waste it, they'd learned to survive. The doctrine that looked wrong on paper proved right in practice. The math that seemed to favor conservation actually favored expenditure. The careful aim that training emphasized mattered less than the aggressive volume that veterans discovered. It took thousands of missions and hundreds of aircraft losses to learn the lesson, but once learned, it changed everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your Point Mine Breaked screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.